In this episode, we talk about whether or not a continent really did sink into the sea, as mentioned in the dialogues of philosopher Plato. Or was it just a metaphor? Real or fiction, it has sparked the imagination, along with other mythic ancient civilizations, buried under rainforests, buried under deserts, and even buried beneath the ice of Antarctica. Join us as we look at Atlantis and other lost worlds. Here we go! And here we are again, finally, for another episode of Paranormal Popcast. I am Nick.
And I'm Vin.
And we are here to talk about Atlantis and other lost worlds, lost civilizations in pop culture. Vin, it's been a while. I feel like we haven't spoken in a while.
Yes.
But Atlantis is one of those really great paranormal pop culture topics that's been done in comic books and movies and TV. And it has inspired other lost civilizations and a lot of stories in fantasy about different worlds. When you think of Atlantis, what comes to mind?
Well, Atlantis as a entity, I think of sort of the typical types of images. You say ancient Greeks, a lot of times the technologically advanced civilization, kind of a utopia, almost like a super intelligent type of civilization, right?
Yeah.
Like something like sort of a higher level of humanity is sort of how I picture it. And I know that the story of Atlantis is about its downfall, really. And I think that carries throughout its influence in pop culture. But really, when I started thinking about Atlantis for this, and you have like a whole list of pop culture comic books and everything, like you just said, that I was looking at, and I'm like, I haven't seen any of this. I haven't really read any of these things. And how am I going to talk about Atlantis? And it sort of struck me like there isn't, and this kind of seems strange to me, there isn't any definitive Atlantis pop culture franchise or movie or something that everybody's seen, right? Like there wasn't a TV show Atlantis. There wasn't anything, and it seemed kind of weird to me. Why would nobody have done this before? How come Steven Spielberg never made an Atlantis movie, you know what I mean, or whatever? And what it sort of said to me was that Atlantis, and this was even interesting because Atlantis is a lost civilization, a lost city, a hidden city. And Atlantis is in pop culture mostly as a reference point for things that aren't Atlantis. Right? All the things that you said that have been influenced and are like the story of Atlantis, but it's not in pop culture as Atlantis. It's in some ways hidden inside of pop culture as all these different hidden worlds.
Yeah, you've got things like resorts and obviously superheroes that are from Atlantis. And you have all these video games that are searching for places that might as well be Atlantis.
Right.
They're just lost civilizations, and there's mystic powers. And one of my favorite games was Myst, and you're going through these portals to find these different worlds and different civilizations, and all of that, like you said, kind of stems from the mythology of what Atlantis was. And I think if you go and ask somebody on the street, "Have you ever heard of Atlantis?" I think a lot of them would say, "Yeah." Sunken city, sunken islands. Like you said, the destruction of it. It's lost.
Yes.
It's destroyed. But if they're like, where did that come from? Some of them might say, a few of them might know, okay, the first reference was by Plato, right, in his writing. A lot of people won't know that. I probably didn't know that until, maybe some of my studies and everything. But it really is interesting. And then you have a lot of other real lost civilizations that people find in archaeology that the rainforests have covered up, and archaeological digs now suddenly find this city, and there was a civilization there, and you're like, oh my God, what were they like, But this story about they reached the peak of what we think when we look at the
Yeah.
myth of Atlantis. You think there might beyond maybe our technology, and maybe that's
Right.
part of what led to
Right.
their downfall. If Atlantis really did exist, what could have caused its downfall? Earthquakes, volcanoes,
Right.
maybe war, flooding. Could have been a lot of reasons if it really existed. And you lose things like the Library of Alexandria. So who knows what wisdom and technology might have been lost if it really existed. But it just sparks the imagination. And then you have other stories like Jules Verne with his Journey to the Center of the Earth, and having civilizations in the center of the earth, the whole hollow earth theory,
Right.
having islands that were never discovered and dinosaurs still exist there, or the animals have evolved differently. Or wondering if you go to Antarctica, is there a civilization buried under all that ice? All these stories. And then the UFOs. Even if Atlantis sank, is it still there? Is there still civilization beneath the ocean? So all these things, I think, stem from that idea and that adventure and just speculation. And I think that has sparked so much creativity and imagination.
Yeah, I think you touched upon this a little bit with the history, and you sort of know it from Plato, and some people do, some people don't. I had to think again as I was preparing for this that, yeah, that was Greek. It is in Greek mythology, but I don't remember it specifically from Greek mythology, right? And I wouldn't have been able to name Plato's works that mention Atlantis in it. But a lot of Greek mythology is part history and part mythology. So there's this gray area with Greek mythology, and probably really any mythology, but we know Greek mythology a little bit better because at least I was taught it in school, and I think most people were, that there's enough there real to speculate what's not real. Speculate more, like extraterrestrials and things like that. Like that's all part of pop culture, as we've talked about. So I think that's part of how Atlantis and the speculation about it can expand in pop culture. One of the things I was going to say too, that what makes it fun is sifting between like what's real and what's not, and what could be real and what could, what is sort of way out there. And you can tie all these things in with underwater UFOs. Like there's a whole thing like that. Well, maybe it is Atlantis, maybe that's what that came from. You like sort of put the two little pieces together and you have a lot of food for stories and making things up. There's an interest, certainly because history is lost unless we record it. Mm-hmm. And back then, of course, there's a lot of history that just wasn't recorded. And if there was a fire, right, or something, history was wiped out. These things are in papyrus, or there's a lost library and all this information that's out there that you have to piece together. So just this uncovering of our history and what might be out there is, I think, a big attraction in pop culture of what Atlantis was. And cities themselves, because cities are a microcosm of civilization.
Yeah.
It's easier to say, oh, there's this lost city, what were these people like, rather than say, there's a lost country, this big open region. It's harder to focus in on. This is what these people were like. This is what the technology was. So I think a lot of stuff just stemmed from Atlantis into all these other fantasies of different cities and what happened to them and why.
Right. And you raise a good point about just history and writing it down. So if there was an Atlantis, how would they have recorded their history? Everything might have been destroyed in all those fires and natural disasters and wars, but it was an oral tradition. These stories were told orally. Right. Like the Odyssey and all these other things, they became epic poems and people would just tell them verbally. So something like Atlantis in Plato's time, I think, might have just been something that people were talking about, just like the Garden of Eden or the Tower of Babel. Or I was reading about the Iram of the Pillars in the Quran. They call it the Atlantis of the Sands, where, again, the same kind of mythological story about this place where the civilization gained this knowledge and the hubris of them just thinking that they were greater than nature and greater than the gods and all this other stuff. And then destruction comes to them. And
Right.
of course, that thinking that whether it's in the Odyssey where Poseidon's angry at Odysseus or some of these others, what led to Atlantis' downfall? What were they tapping into? What secret knowledge were they forbidden to tap into? And it goes into us with creating the nuclear bomb. And are we playing with things beyond our level of really dealing with it? And will we destroy our own civilization for that? So all these parallels that you can talk about. But I find it interesting that if Plato was the first to really record it that we know of. Since then, a lot of people didn't delve into telling stories about Atlantis. You hear other stories about other civilizations and other mythological places. And then it wasn't until late 1800s when people like Jules Verne mentions it in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And then others start writing novels and talking about the story. And that's the age of discovery. That's when people were learning new things. So it wasn't even around the time of finding what we call the New World, where you find a whole new continent. It was later, the 1800s, when science fiction was starting to come around, where people were telling these stories of adventure and the supernatural and things like that, that suddenly it started tapping into people's imaginations and you started getting these stories, whether it's specifically about Atlantis or something very similar, mysterious islands and underground civilizations and adventurers going into the unknown and finding clues to ancient Egyptian mummies and things like that. I just find that interesting as well.
Well, part of it, and this was something I read along the way, was that if you think about it, there was a resurgence or a rediscovery of ancient Greece and the Enlightenment. All the founding fathers and prior to them, Newton and everything, started rediscovering these texts, led to the democratic revolutions, technology, all those kind of things. But when you think about it, up until the 18th century, society and civilization didn't change all that much, right? It was agrarian, it was a horse and wagon, it was no electricity, whatever. Obviously, ancient Rome was very different than 16th, 17th, 18th century Britain. So I think with Atlantis and where there was a resurgence in the interest in Greek texts and everything during the Enlightenment. So that was 18th century Europe and America and things like that. But society up to that point over time did not develop technologically all that much. With still horse and wagon, people rode horses. It was agrarian cultures. Certainly there were differences between ancient Egypt, Roman Empire, and then through Europe. But for the most part, we didn't see a world that started to come into being in the 19th century. And so what I was reading about was that when the Industrial Revolutions began, there was much more concern about what was happening to the world. And that all came into play. And the lessons that were learned from Atlantis in Plato's writings and what Atlantis really was, a lot of what was written afterwards concerning Atlantis was really looking at the lessons. So the things like in The Lord of the Rings, looking at utopias and fallen cities, and we're losing the world that we had. We're on the path of Atlantis. And so I think that was the reason you saw in the 19th century, it's starting to come into pop culture really for the first time with those kind of concerns. And that's really where it fits into pop culture, is the lessons that are being learned from Atlantis, how greed and power and all those things lead to the downfall of a civilization that supposedly has all this hope, right?
Yeah.
All this scientific discovery. We're learning all these things. We have technology and electricity, and all these things are convenient to make society better. And we're more and more and more advanced. We're at, like you said, the peak of civilization, yet here we are inventing the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Here we are in World War II ripping Europe apart. And that's the second war in a couple of decades.
And all this history that's there
apart.
too, that's being bombed to oblivion, right?
Right, exactly.
So again, is it a parallel to whatever wars might have destroyed some of these civilizations, Atlantis included?
Right.
And also I think the timing too, with archaeology being what it was around that time, finding dinosaur bones, paleontologists, and just reshaping history and realizing, hey, there were these giant creatures on the earth before human beings, and even Egyptology, digging up these tombs of pharaohs of the past and all this stuff where people just started rethinking. And of course, the newspapers at the time telling these stories of people going and discovering islands where there's new species that were never thought of. And just the imagination again goes crazy. And then those stories where people were just writing stories about these adventurers going and all the curses that might be in these places where we're not supposed to touch them and dig them up. Do you remember any favorites growing up? Like I mentioned Jules Verne being one of my favorites when I was like around 12 and just sparking my imagination. And here's a story that was written in the 1800s that I still found just fascinating, that somebody would follow this professor's writings and he went on a journey, and now you're going and you're finding different things. There's a whole continent, a whole ocean beneath the surface of the earth. And it's played up again with the Godzilla and King Kong stories and things like that. It seems like it's these tropes that lived on. They're very mythical. People resonate towards them. And you can see even in the ancient times, probably that's where we as human beings kind of went. We were fascinated by things like that.
Yeah. I think I was also exposed to Journey to the Center of the Earth. I remember there was a Disney movie, right?
Or that was adapted
like
a few times.
Yeah, it was. I remember seeing that movie, and I loved it. For me, and someone who loves writing and loves fantasy and all that stuff, that's one of the things that sparked my imagination. All those from that time, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I think, again, that was a time where Disney, or could have been other producers, were delving into those stories for children's programming. You know what I mean? So we could probably think of a lot of things that were geared towards us when we were kids. And of course, it was before you had streaming and all these, like an explosion of CGI movies. So you could really do a lot with it. They were very small things, but I think a lot of it they were pulling from the 19th century science fiction type work. So yeah, I have a recollection of those things. And I remember being fascinated by the Nautilus.
Yeah.
And Captain Nemo. I didn't get the nuance of Captain Nemo, and I'm sure they didn't present it like that. But yeah, that whole thing was fascinating, even exploring under the ocean, because for us at the time, that was, and for science in general, and still, it's a lost world.
Yep.
But I wrote down, too, that because you talked about archaeology, but as a kid too, I remember Land of the Lost.
I loved Land of the Lost.
Right? You know, and that, again, that was sort of like it's a portal fantasy, and I could talk about later, but portal fantasies all sort of tie into this. They go to a different world that's better than yours, and has danger and stuff. Land of the Lost, I don't think really fits into presenting the world as something amazing, but it does go into this notion that we're discovering things that we never knew were there, right? Like the dinosaurs, and they still at that time didn't know how the dinosaurs died, right? Really. At least we, on our level, were not taught because it wasn't established. I mean, I'm sure the theories about how it happened. But Land of the Lost was another one that I really enjoyed, and I think sort of fits into this idea of uncovering lost worlds.
Yeah. And if you think about it, the Sleestak, the lizard people that they encounter, they find this lost civilization, this lost town where they're from, but they've regressed. They've kind of gone back to their more primal instinct creatures. And then there's one of them, Enoch, or I forget what his name was, right, who is from that point in time, and he can't believe that their civilization has been destroyed or that they've reverted back to these kind of primitive versions of themselves. And it's, again, that lost city, that lost technology. And as a kid, this was a kid's show, and I just found it fascinating. And I was like, I would love to see an episode where they go back in time to when this was thriving and this wasn't in ruins.
Right.
Where do all these portals lead to, you know? I just loved it. That was a great show. And when they try to reboot it, they kind of lost some of that. They didn't really talk about it. And that was the best part. That was the part that really
Yeah.
sparked the imagination. But you talk about portals, that's a whole subgenre. And I think that
Yeah.
does stem from Atlantis.
Right.
All these things like Oz and Narnia and Wonderland, you're going through some entry point to another world. And it's
Right.
a world that we don't see. And you still see it in like Harry Potter and all these others,
Right.
where there's this other dimension, other area hidden from regular people. And whether it's Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere or places subterranean under the earth, we don't even realize that there's this whole
Yeah.
place, this whole thriving economy and people living and fighting and battling. And it's incredible. And I think that is a great storytelling point that we owe a lot to things like Atlantis, this notion, all these lost civilizations in the wilderness.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this, because I mentioned before, is that in a lot of ways it's presented to the reader as somewhere you would like to go, right? Whether it's Narnia or Middle Earth. And I particularly, as a fantasy reader, would put Stephen Donaldson's The Land in there very much so. I don't know if you've ever read that, but it's a different kind of fantasy. But for sure, the land itself, that's the name of the world, is the land, is presented as a kind of utopia at the beginning of the series. But what it sets up, because there is danger, there is evil in these lands, and it sets it up as something worth fighting for. Whereas Atlantis, we don't know what really happened there. So we're not saying like, oh, this is worth fighting for, this is not worth fighting for, but it was this utopia and something happened and it wasn't good.
Yeah.
Right. So I think to your point, a lot of the portal fantasies follow that framework. Here's a great place that's on the verge of falling. And of course, then, as I said before, that ties into the thinking of the time in the late 19th, 20th century, and of course now into the 21st century.
Yeah. And then I guess for me, when Atlantis and pop culture kind of pops into my head is the comic books. So I'm trying to remember if you were a huge comic book collector when you were younger, but both the two big ones, Marvel and DC, they both have their own Atlantis mythology. So Marvel has Prince Namor, the Submariner, and then DC, of course, has Aquaman, and they both come from Atlantis. Aquaman is half human. Namor is a mutant, right? That's why he has the wings on his feet, so he could breathe in air and in Atlantis underwater, whereas Arthur Curry, Aquaman, his mom was from Atlantis and his dad was human. So the notion, too, of the above world incriminating into the sea, and I think Marvel did a lot of that, where Prince Namor was wanting to conquer the folks above land. He gets into battles with Fantastic Four, and he becomes this anti-hero. So he's got anger and rage and things. And then for DC, Aquaman is more the superhero Justice League, the guy that can talk telepathically to the fish and the dolphins, right? So, but what do you think of that? Do you have any remembrance of that in your comic book reading?
I don't, because I really didn't read comic books, which is funny because, like I said, I was looking at this and I said, it's strange that there's not some sort of definitive Atlantis work, but it looks like it's being done in comic books. There's probably a lot in there, as you're saying, in terms of Atlantis, although I still find it odd that being there, it wasn't put in any of these franchise movies, these Marvel universes and DC. And I get like Aquaman, he doesn't get a lot of respect.
He doesn't, right?
Right?
They always used to make
He doesn't
fun
get
of
a
him.
lot of respect, but now like that you say like it's part of Atlantis.
Yeah.
I mean, you could play around with them. There's just not like fighting in the ocean. You know what I mean? Like,
well, that's what makes it
amphibious.
so hard to film. It's hard to, how do they even talk? And that's where you have to bring up the telepathy, or they make these air bubbles around themselves, or it's a domed city under the sea. All these things they have to kind of try to make work to explain how can it still be a place that's habitable to these creatures, right? But that's when you have to kind of like the notion that it's another dimension or taking you to different times and it's a spiritual realm and things like that. That's how fantasy writers kind of play up on it. And I realize there's been a lot of novels about it that's been done as well. But
well, Lucas did it with the Gungans.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much his Atlantis, right?
All you have to do is put like something in your mouth and you can breathe underwater,
That's very
like no
true.
problem.
That's very true.
Train as a Jedi, hold your breath for a long time and then put, something in your mouth and you're all good. But yeah, there's another one. There was another hidden world, of underwater.
The subterranean world and the hollow earth theory, I think to me, that was also very fascinating, stemming from Journey to the Center of the Earth. But King Kong and Godzilla, they also played up on that, where there was these islands. So King Kong had Skull Island, right? Where you had human beings living on there, but there were also these dinosaurs and giant snakes and giant apes living away from civilization. And it only took human beings coming back to disturb that and to investigate it. I think in the first King Kong movie, they were making like a documentary or a film. And then they bring King Kong back to civilization, and that's where all the madness takes place. And in the later movies, there's the underground, these giant creatures are coming from beneath the earth. There's a whole civilization under there. And Godzilla was kind of the same way. When they started adding all these other monsters, they came up with Monster Island. So one of my favorite Godzilla movies in the old days was Destroy All Monsters. And you actually have them all fighting on this one island. And it goes back again to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne coming up with these notions of islands that kind of were so isolated that evolution kind of went its own way without being tainted by everything else around the earth. So you had different creatures, and you see it happening in reality. I mean, there's these plants like the corpse flower that grew in like Sumatra that are like 12 feet tall. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is like from another planet, right? So again, sparking the imagination of what can happen, where life kind of is so diverse and so different, and even civilizations maybe could find a way to survive in the most extreme situations, Yeah,
I think there's a theme going through there about corruption, right? Obviously, Atlantis was this, but what I was going to say before was that where you read a lot of comic books, so you were exposed to this, specifically Atlantis, but there's a lot of it in fantasy, which I read, but it's just not Atlantis. And there's, of course, Middle Earth, and really in there are two things. There's Gondolin, which is the city that is literally a hidden city. And it was specifically built to be hidden from the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, to protect the people and protect the elves. But the lesson in that story was that those who hid in Gondolin were never found. No one knew they were there. The secret was kept. But they also let everyone who was outside perish under Morgoth until they were betrayed and they found it or whatever. But again, the notion of it is like an ethical dilemma. And it comes into what's the right thing to do. Yeah, you can hide and protect yourself and hide yourself. But one, you can't do that forever. And you're making a moral decision, sort of like the trolley car problem of, do you pull the switch if there's 5 people on the track or 1 person on the track and that kind of thing. So there's that story in the Silmarillion. And there's also the fall of Numenor, which is more like a Sodom and Gomorrah story. They became jealous and corrupt, and if my memory serves me correct, they became jealous of the immortals, like the elves and the Iluvatar or whatever it was. And then the Eru, I have to read the Silmarillion again, actually, because I read it a long time ago and I remember some of it, but that immortal or god or deity, whatever you want to call him, sank Numenor to the bottom of the sea, which is a direct reference to Atlantis. But those are both definitely part of the fantasy realm and also derived from Atlantis. You had put in your notes here Shangri-La.
Yeah.
Which, again, it's a paradise. To me, thinking of Shangri-La is a reference to the Garden of Eden, again, which is sort of presented as an island. I don't know if the Garden of Eden is ever physically portrayed as an island. I'm not sure, but I always
there's
sort of
supposed to be rivers on certain, so it's like, it's kind of like...
Yeah, because I sort of always pictured it as that, and maybe like artwork depicted it as an island, but it's just about this isolated paradise that again gets corrupted.
Yeah. And calling it a
So
garden
yeah,
implies that it's curated, it's cultivated,
yeah,
whether it's in the story of the Garden of Eden, whether it's created by God and then the humans tend to it, but it's not just a wilderness, it's not just wild, right?
right,
So it's like
yeah,
all these
yeah,
other civilizations, they've been built by human beings that are now lost, that are now no longer there, but the artifacts are still there, right? It's still a physical place somewhere that can be found, right? And I
right,
think that's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it fascinating.
yeah, yeah. I mean, most of these things, I think, again, the notions of mythology and religion and history, the lines between them are blurred. So there is this feeling that you can reach these places, and they're very powerful in scripture and religious texts, in philosophy, all these things. Like, is there an actual place that's paradise, or is it achievable here through us, or are we just in a world where we're so imperfect? That's the lesson. We try to achieve this, but we can't. That's a lot of stuff, but it's really all encapsulated in the story of Atlantis.
Yeah. Yeah. And also this notion of lost history that people lived and learned and had knowledge before we were around, and who knows what they might have done. How did we build the pyramids? How did we put those statues on Easter Island? Stonehenge, all this. What was going on back then? And science fiction plays up on that.
Yeah.
H.P. Lovecraft, Star Trek, they talk about the old ones and things like that, where it's like these mysterious creatures and civilizations that created, maybe even seeded the planets. And then you start finding little hints of it. Sometimes you dig it up and you bring things back like monsters, right? I loved Myst. Did you play that video game, Myst?
I
think you
did,
did.
yes.
Yeah. So that was that notion where the game,
Yeah.
unlike other video games where you kind of are given a little plot and here's what you have to do, the game just starts and you wake up and you open your eyes and you're somewhere and you just go and discover things and you find clues and you find puzzles, and that leads to portals to other worlds. You see ruins, and that tapped into that notion too. I think that stems from something like Atlantis and these lost worlds.
Yeah. I mean, Lost, right?
Lost the
The
TV
TV
series,
show,
yeah, absolutely.
almost seems like it was inspired by Myst,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you had these weird, out of place, out of time artifacts and, monuments and things in this island where they were stranded. The only thing was, I don't feel there was any sort of real explanation as to what was going
I
on.
felt they were making it up as they went along myself.
Right.
So.
I think we know a little bit more about that trick from some other works of the gentleman who created it. But had that tried to tie into some of these philosophical ideas of what this world was and what were the implications of what they were doing on the island, it just never sort of tied the themes together. I mean, when you think about it, all the references were there, like John Locke and the names of the characters. And it almost seems like it pulled from that. You really can't tell what it was pulling from because it never tied it together. But it seems to me that there was a way to tie it together. It didn't have to explain everything, but it could have just been, about a fall of a civilization or Lord of the Flies. All these things are about that sort of corruption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And isolating a group and saying, this is what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier at the beginning that there wasn't a definitive Atlantis TV show or movie. And you're probably right, because as I was looking to see it, I saw the cartoon Atlantis, The Lost Continent that Disney made. It wasn't a musical or anything, so it didn't do much. Like, it seems like cartoons by Disney have to have music in it. But Michael J. Fox was the voice of it. There was an old TV series with Patrick Duffy called Man from Atlantis. I never watched it, so I don't know if it was any good or not. There was Stargate Atlantis. That was one of the spin-offs of Stargate. I didn't watch that. I kind of gave up on the series after a lot of the spin-offs. But yeah, there weren't really like specific something really major. I mean, I think there was like a Hercules Italian movie where he goes to Atlantis and
Mm-hmm.
battles monsters from there. But the impact, the legacy, you could see it everywhere. We talked about the video games and the comic books and all these adventure stories. It really is very influential when it comes to things like that.
That
And I noticed there's a lot of fantasy novels too that are exploring that. But yeah, it's very influential.
Yeah. One of the things that I really find it interesting is it really that hard to portray or to come up with a story with it? It hasn't been done before. But again, I wouldn't call this necessarily season like going into fantasy worlds and stuff, but certainly with archaeology and the supernatural is Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Uh-huh.
right? And I mean, they may have referenced Atlantis at some point along the way in those movies, but for some of the later ones where what they chose as the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull or the Dial of Destiny, which were probably not the most interesting or the best subject matter for the movies, even that didn't touch Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why wouldn't Indiana Jones, those movies, delve into Atlantis?
It should have, because they did a video game.
They
In
did
my
do a
research,
video game, yes.
1992, right? The Fate of Atlantis.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like his character, all these serial characters that are going out there for adventure, totally inspired by Journey to the Center of the Earth and finding clues and finding hidden treasures and lost ruins and all the video games that came after that, Lara Croft, Uncharted,
It's
right? All of these have their genesis in finding these lost worlds, these lost artifacts, right?
and it's the perfect, or it fits into or aligns with the notion of that blurred line between what's real and what's mythic. That's what Raiders of the Lost Ark was doing. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first one, was very much where you're looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Do we really know whether that existed or not? Not really, but it's very close to history. The second one was a little bit more magical, the Temple of Doom. Third one was, again, the blurred line between real history and what's myth, the Holy Grail, and the idea of the Fountain of Youth and all that kind of stuff. So Atlantis would just be like a perfect type of franchise or to be used in franchise, and it just never has been as a specific entity.
Yeah, really wanting to explore all those chambers and temples and whatever else was part of that world. What have we left out? Anything? Have you ever been to one of these resorts that's been named after Atlantis? Because it seems like you go to the Bahamas and it's like, how do we turn this resort, this escape, into something mythic? And Atlantis just has that connotation of just magical and water. So you have that in the Bahamas, and you've got other places. They just throw the name Atlantis and it already just has that vibe to it, right?
There's one, I've never been to one of those resorts, but I don't know if it's still there, but there was a place out in the Hamptons that had, I think it was called Atlantis or the Atlantis or something like that, because it could have been Atlantic, but I don't think so, because it was like a restaurant sort of resort, sort of a wedding place. So that's one that I know of. I don't know if it's still out there. But yeah, I mean, most of these, or not most, but a lot of places will use that name to evoke the sense of paradise.
Yeah. And I guess when you mention Atlantic, the Atlantic Ocean, what came first, the name Atlantis or the name of the ocean? And what is the root of? I should do my research on that too, because there's probably some interesting connection there as well. But yeah, this has been great. I'm glad we've been talking about this. And it's exactly what sparks my imagination when you think about the kind of stories that I love to tell and love to watch and love to hear. Is just Atlantis is really one of the roots of that. It goes back to ancient times, and people are always looking to find it. And it's come to be like a symbol, I guess, to represent that lost paradise, lost utopia that maybe is still around somewhere. And if we just hunt around and find it, it'll be there waiting for us to jump back in.
It's about, searching for paradise and the risk of losing it.
That's very
Yeah.
well said. Very nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Vin. Thank you all
you.
for listening, and hopefully we'll be back, not in
Yes.
like 6 months from now or anything, but pretty soon. So share your comments on what we've left out, any ideas you might have on the topic, any good movies that might be on the topic that you think we should be watching, and like, follow, subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Paranormal Popcast.